am very privileged to be here and to be here anyway, because when I think of all those years that the war actually started almost 74 years ago, and that we were liberated this May about 68 years ago. And so the miracle of my survival it's so amazing and so lucky that I just can't believe sometimes that I'm here. I had a call yesterday from a professor of history in San Diego who told me that he was teaching his students about the Holocaust, and that he got my name from Steven Spielberg because he said I was the youngest. And the thought of it, that I'm still here and that so few of the survivors are left, it really just scared me. Because it is so important for the survivors to share our story with the younger generation. Because I think that I have this fear that what's going to happen to memory when we are no longer alive and our number are diminishing every day. And so because we are eyewitnesses, because we were there, we feel compelled to share our stories and hoping to pass the torch of memory to the younger generation so that it will never be forgotten. There are so many people nowadays that say Holocaust didn't happen. We have a wonderful program now where we have what we call legacy partners. And some of the teachers are joining those survivors that are still alive and also are speaking for some of the survivors that are no longer with us. And they go to schools and talk about our experiences so that we can hope that those who perished will always be remembered. I am one of the lucky ones because I survived on Schindler's List. I survived with my mother, I survived with my grandfather and an uncle. If it was not for Oskar Schindler, I wouldn't be here. Oskar Schindler gave us a life. He gave me a life to grow up, to get married, to have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Oskar Schindler was like the only one who stood up, didn't look away, and made a difference. And he is the only one that has proven to the world that one person can make a difference. Some people say, what made him do it? We don't know. He was not a perfect man, but some of the so-called perfect people, they were behind the locked door and closed windows and didn't care what was going on. Oskar Schindler, even though he was a member of the Nazi Party, he wore a diamond swastika on his lapels. He had many so-called friends in high places, in the Wehrmacht, in the War Department, and of course in the Gestapo. And it was so unlikely that Oskar Schindler, who was a very ambitious young man, who really came to Krakow, to Poland, because he wanted to become rich. He wanted to have a business that would bring him a lot of money. He loved beautiful clothes, he loved expensive cars, he loved horses. And so when he took over a business in Krakow, Poland, he depended on his Jewish workers to make him rich because he didn't know anything about running of the business. But to Oskar Schindler, his workers became his friends. He did not look at us as we were inhuman, that we were worse than rats or ants. We were his friends, and he was doing everything he could to keep us alive. I was born in Krakow. I was 10 years old when the war started. And as a little girl growing up in Krakow, I have wonderful memories of being an only child, My father was one of 8 brothers. My mother was one of 7 siblings. I was surrounded by a loving family, aunts and uncles and cousins. And because I was so young, I didn't really know much about what was going on in the world. I was always aware that about the pogroms, about anti-Semitism, but it was far away. It was not around me. I was loved by my family. I think that my first experience with anti-Semitism came when I went to school, and I was in the 1st grade. And I remember playing outside at recess, hopscotch with other people, girls, when one of them picked up a stone, threw it at me, and said, "You dirty Jew." And I came home crying. I said to my mother, "How could she call me dirty? I took a bath this morning." My mom tried to explain to me something about the history of anti-Semitism, of course in Poland was highly encouraged by the government and by the church. But I still had a loving home and a wonderful family, and I wasn't afraid of anything happening to me. And of course, all this changed on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. And overnight, from being a little girl, I became an enemy of the state. Overnight, all the civil rights were taken away from the Jewish people. We were stripped of everything that we knew, that we had, that we expected, that we worked for. Our businesses were confiscated. Our bank accounts were confiscated. We were on a very strict hours. We had curfews. We were not allowed to walk on a sidewalk. We were not allowed to go to the temples. Most of the temples were either burned or turned into stables. We were not allowed to go to school. And mostly we were told that we would not be allowed to remain in Krakow. Krakow became the center of the government of the Nazis. And it was in Krakow and its surrounding communities that the Jewish people had to wear a white armband with a blue Star of David embroidered on it. We were, unlike the rest of Poland, there were the people who were wearing, yellow stars. And I remember my father saying, "It's okay, because that can't last very long, and something will happen when the world outside will hear what's happening to us. They will come and save us." Because, when I was growing up, my father traveled a lot, and we always saw that Germany, its people, is very enlightened. After all, they were known for its famous composers and writers. And they were ordinary people you come across every day of your life. They were doctors and lawyers and policemen and plumbers, electricians, people you meet every day. They were fathers and sons and husbands and brothers. So how could anybody imagine that all those people, all those members of the German SS and Nazi, that they would become cold-blooded murderers with absolutely no conscience, no feelings for Jewish people, whose only crime was that we were Jewish. And my father was very optimistic. He said, "Don't worry, we will do whatever they want us to do, because it's not going to last very long." And one of the first things that the Germans did was to tell us that we would be resettled. Krakow at the time had about 250,000 people, and about 40 were Jewish. And the 40,000 Jewish people were allowed to live all over the city. There was a Jewish section in Krakow called Kazimierz, but at the same time, the Jewish people could live wherever they wanted. And so we were told that anybody under 12 and anybody over 50 was deemed unfit to work, would be resettled to the farms, to have the farmer grow food for the German army. And I remember as we were told to report to the headquarters, and I remember standing in line, waiting our turn, and I remember that trucks came, and a lot of soldiers came down. They were heavily armed, They were heavily armed, not just with their rifles and revolvers, but also with the dogs that were trained to tear people apart. And I remember standing in line, and one of the soldiers was maybe 6-7 feet away from me with one of those dogs. Seems to me that they had such huge, big Doberman pinchers, whatever those dogs were, and they had a muzzle and they were growling, and the soldier was threatening to let it go on me. Now I was 10 years old. And then the soldiers started to separate the families. They were putting men and boys to one side, women and children to the other side. And then they started to take children away from the parents. And of course, people were screaming and crying. The dogs were barking, the Germans were shooting. And I remember standing there in front of this huge building in this big square, and right across the street, Polish people they were occupied, but they were not enslaved. So people were walking by, they were going to schools or businesses, shops were open, and a streetcar was going by, just like if nothing was happening to their friends and neighbors. It's like we didn't exist. Nobody saw us, nobody heard us, and nobody cared. In those few days where we were given the permits, I was lucky. I got my permit. My parents falsified my birth certificate, made me 2 years older. I was lucky I was told for my age. About 50,000 of the Jewish people immediately were resettled. We thought we would hear from them because they were supposed to work on farms, and we thought they were gonna be better off, but we never heard from them. And the rest of us were told that we had to be moved into a ghetto. Now, what is a ghetto? Does anybody know what is a ghetto? You know, it was just a part of the older part of the city across the river. They would put a wall about maybe 1 avenue wide and 4 blocks long. And into this small place, they were going to put over 20,000 people because they were also the Germans were bringing a lot of Jewish families from surrounding communities. And we were told we only had like a week, I think, to pack up, get rid of all our belongings. We're only allowed to take about a small suitcase, I think it was 50 kilos. And we could take a pushcart on which we were able to put some mattresses and towels and bed sheets and all this sort of thing, some dishes. And I remember we were packing, and it was March. It was beginning of March. By March 8th of 1940, we were supposed to be in the ghetto. And I remember that we got dressed in so many layers. I was wearing a snowsuit with a lot of sweaters, a lot of socks, a lot of everything, because on this little suitcase you couldn't really put that much. And I remember standing in my apartment in this building right across the river and right around the corner from an ancient castle that I loved. I remember standing and looking around. I remember looking at my room. I had a collection of Shirley Temple dolls, and I was given a Shirley Temple doll during all kind of emergencies, like when I had my tonsils out. My mother gave me a choice: what do you want, a book or a Shirley Temple doll? Or when I had a good grades, and I usually had grades, and so I would get a book or a Shirley Temple doll. And I remember standing there. I couldn't take anything. My mother said there is no room, because we knew that we were not going to be given a big apartment. We knew we were going to have a very small space sharing with another family. And I remember my mother made me polish the mail slot in my door. She wanted to make sure that we left everything nice and clean. We had to turn the key into the superintendent of the building. And as we walked out, leaving linen in the linen closet, dishes in the pantry, clothes hanging in a closet, the books that we loved, the dolls that I loved. My mother, I remember, had a little china, beautiful china a tea set that was her wedding present and that she loved. Everything looked like we were going to come back. And we walked down the stairs, and I remember knocking at the doors of some of my neighbors, whom I knew very well, that we were very friendly with. I wanted to say goodbye, but there was nobody was home. Everybody left. And so as we walked away from the building and I looked back, that's where I was born, that's where I lived the first 10 years of my life. And I realized that all my neighbors were looking at us. They were peering at us from behind those closed windows and behind those lacy curtains. And as we walked through the streets of Krakow into the ghetto over the bridge, there were people with young children standing there throwing mud at us and said, "Good riddance, Jews, don't ever come back." And then we walked behind this wall into the ghetto. The windows outside of the wall had to be covered with plywood. We were not supposed to look out. And I remember we got an assignment in a huge apartment building. It was so old that the bathrooms were outside in a hall. And my father said, "Don't worry. Don't worry, because it's not going to last long. The world outside will hear what's happening. They will come and save us." And behind the walled fences, behind all those barbed wires, across the street, the life went on for the Polish people. Actually, the streetcar went through the ghetto. Of course, it never stopped. So there is no way that anybody could say, "I didn't know." No way. There we were for all the world to see. Life in ghetto was very difficult. We were very crowded. We had a small apartment. There was a tiny kitchen, and I to this day remember that the sink in the kitchen was so low and so tiny that it reminded me of the Seven Dwarfs. I remember the first bedroom was shared by my father's brother, Rubin, and his wife, Nettie, and my little cousin, Heshu. He was only 4 years old. And another family, and the next bedroom was for my father, my mother, and me. There was another couple there with a sister. They put a hook on each side of the wall and a rope, and we hung up sheets, and so we each had our own little privacy. And my father said, "Don't worry, it's not going to last." In the meantime, we had to be working so that we could still be alive, stay alive. And so very smart people in the ghetto arranged for workshops. People who owned businesses before opened businesses in the workshops, and there were many workshops that we were employed 12 hours a day on swing shift, working very hard to make the German rich, because of course we were slaves, so we were not paid for it. I was working in the beginning in a printing shop. Other people, my cousins were working in a shop where they were making brushes and brooms. Some were working for a tailor, some were working for the shoemaker, for the fur maker. Everybody was working constantly. We felt we will show them, we will work hard till help comes. Help did not come. And even though we were working very hard, we were exposed to every day, every moment of the day, of searches. The guards would come in and look at people and would say you and you and you, because maybe they didn't like their looks, or somebody was too old, and they would collect those people and they would take them away. And we never knew how or why. One of those days, I was told that my grandparents, my mother's parents, will not get a permit anymore, and I had to hide with them. And since I lived in such a huge building, apartment building, there was a huge courtyard. It had mountains of dirt and leaves and whatever else. And my mother helped to make us like a tunnel. And we went into the tunnel, my grandfather, my grandmother, and myself. And I remember laying on my stomach, holding on to the ground. It was very early in the morning, because probably 4 o'clock in the morning, and about an hour later, I felt the ground shaking. And I realized, it felt like an earthquake, like a hurricane. I didn't know what it was. It was the trucks bringing the soldiers into the ghetto, and then the soldiers jumping out and running down the streets with their boots making such noise. And they ran into all the buildings one at a time, up and down the stairs, looking for people who were hiding. Every now and then you could hear a shot when they found somebody in hiding. And it seemed like an eternity. And they finally started to leave. I could hear them, I could almost feel that they were poking the mountain of dirt where we were hiding with their rifles. Luckily they didn't have any dogs with them, and they left. And finally my mom came in and helped us to get out, crawled out from under the dirt, and I remember standing up and trying to get my hair clean, and I was taking out all the dirt, and all of a sudden we came face to face with the last patrol of the day. I don't know where they came from because there was nobody left anymore, just us. And they took one look at my grandparents, of course, they took them away. And it was a miracle that they didn't shoot me and my mom, because obviously we were hiding with them. And it was the last time I saw my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, and I was very close to them. And then about a few weeks later, the dreaded knock came on our door, and my father was arrested and taken away. We were told that he was a member of resistance, which was not true. We know it was not true. Somebody obviously told the Nazis that's what it was, so they took my father away. And they took my father away. I couldn't imagine how we would survive, because my father was very influential. He had a lot of friends, and he was helping everyone, not just his family, but everyone, whoever needed help. At one time, my aunt, my father's older sister, gave birth to a little baby in the ghetto, and he was sick. He didn't have enough nourishment. And my father actually arranged for my aunt and my little cousin to go out of the ghetto to a doctor outside that would help. And this little boy lived for a few months, for 2 years almost. But then it was again another order. We were going to be, the ghetto was liquidated, and we were going to move to a camp, concentration camp, Plaszow, about 7 kilometers outside of the ghetto. And I don't know if any of you have seen Schindler's List, and if you haven't seen it, I hope you will, because everything in that movie is actually everything that really happened to all those who survived, and everything that happened to me. Amgad, a sadistic, vicious murderer, was put in charge of liquidating the ghetto and of building the Plaszow concentration camp. Plaszow concentration camp was built in a sleepy little village on these 2 Jewish cemeteries. The ground was leveled, the tombstones were broken, and you can imagine what happens when the grounds in a cemetery are leveled. The men were sent to build barracks, and women were sent to build the roads. If you can imagine trying to build a road from broken tombstone. Women were sitting all along the roads trying to make sense out of broken tombstone. Amgad, who was actually from Vienna, had a very influential, respected family. They were in publishing business, and we thought, well, he's from Vienna, so he is going to be much better. He was not. Amgad used to stand on the villa of the veranda every morning when the people came and went from work, and he would go hunting with his long-range rifle. But Amgad was hunting for people. And one of the first people shot by Amgad was my Uncle Roman, my father's younger brother, with his father next to him and one of his sons next to him. For no reason. He was like way across from the villa, doing his business, painting the barracks. And then when Amgad got sick and tired of standing on the villa, he would come down and watch the women work he would stand behind us, or he would come down with his dog, and if you didn't say good morning, Herr Rolf, then you would be shot. I was sitting building the road, or trying to build the road, with next to my mother and my friend Stella. Stella was a neighbor of mine, a friend of mine, who lived in the same house. Her little brother had cerebral palsy, and so her parents, a little brother, disappeared at the very beginning of the war. And so we took care of her. So she was sitting next to me, and all of a sudden she fell. And I looked at her, and I whispered, sit up, Armageddon is coming. And put my hand behind her and wanted to help her out. I realized my hand was wet. I realized he shot her. Armageddon shot her. She was standing sitting right next to me. I didn't hear, I didn't know. When we had to leave the ghetto, when the barracks were ready, we're not allowed, again, anybody under 12 and anybody over 50 was not allowed to leave because they were deemed unfit to work. Again, we were, whatever little sense we had to leave it behind because we were only allowed a small suitcase. Stupid of us, we actually packed a suitcase with the things that remember. I remember to this day that I had a little velvet jacket and I thought it would be good for me to take it, it was warm. But my mother and I were taking care of my little cousin Jenny. Jenny was 5 years old. She was the daughter of my mother's sister. They were taken away from us, and somehow my father, when he was still with us, managed to grab this little girl and brought her to live with us, thinking we would be able to save her. She was blonde, she had blue eyes, she was adorable. You know, our children were so smart. They knew they had to be quiet. They would be hiding under the bed or in the closets when all of the adults had to work. They never cried, they never complained. You know, Adolf Hitler wanted to have the Aryan nation. Well, you all know what he looked like, or all the people that were important in his cabinet, what did they look like? They were not blonde, they were not blue-eyed, they were not skinny. Our children, just like children everywhere, were beautiful. They were blonde, blue-eyed, brown hair, brown eyes, black eyes, red hair. They were beautiful, just like children everywhere, but not in the eyes of the Nazis. And so as I tried to take my Jenny with me, I was wearing a long coat, I remember. She was holding on to me. And I tried to go through the gate to Plaszow with my little suitcase. I remember there was my father's watch. I had to leave it. I was not allowed to take it. And as I tried to go through the gate, one of the Jewish policemen noticed her and told me not to. I can't take her. I have to leave her in the orphan's home. And you know, I was very happy to leave her in the orphan's home because the Germans were bringing the children from all the surrounding communities and into the orphan's home. And so I was sure, and so we were all, that the children would be well taken care of in the orphanage. After all, the nuns run the orphans' homes so the children would be safe. That's how stupid we were, so naive. And we left. I remember walking through the gate with the people I worked with, and I realized that a few of them, in their backpack, they were carrying their little children that were drugged. And those were the people, lucky enough, the next day they would go to work and they would be able to smuggle their little children to some of their Catholic Polish friends, those righteous Gentiles, those who really risked their lives and the lives of their families to help a Jewish child, because they were in danger not just of the authorities, but of their neighbor. Because if a neighbor would suspect them of hiding a Jewish child, they would report them to the authorities for a loaf of bread or a bag of potatoes. Coming Plaszow, and I think of those barracks, and I'm sure you have seen the barracks in some of the movies, those long barracks, where what we didn't have bunk beds, what we call shelves, we call it breeches. High mattresses filled with hay. We had no sheets, we had no blankets. The very first night, the guards came into the barracks and made sure that whoever had any jewelry would give it to them. And I was, well, by that time probably I was like 12 years old, and I had little earrings that were given to me, I think, when I was 6 months old by my grandmother. And they were tiny little earrings with little blue stones, like forget-me-nots. And of course, you know, my mother thought, why somebody's going to look at her adorable daughter, they're not going to do anything. Well, the soldier just pulled it off my ear. Somehow I was lucky he didn't pull my ear. It was open up. Life in ghetto was horrible, but life in Plaszow was unthinkable. The fear, the hunger, the constant exposure to avant-garde. Every morning and every night after we reported to the, what they call Apr, when we reported for roll call, before we went to work, the workshops were moved from the ghetto to the concentration camp Plaszow, and we all worked. And we again worked very hard because we thought help will come. Many mornings we spent standing for a roll call, and we were exposed to constant torture. People were taken, people were beaten, people were hanged for no reason at all. We were hungry, we were sick, life was, you cannot explain of the way we were treated with the hate, with such viciousness. No, it was unthinkable then, and it's unthinkable to do this day. How can human beings become so sadistic and so without any feelings, and just the opposite feelings they had was that they were doing the right things? How can any person, any nation in this world think that they are better than somebody else? In the meantime, Oskar Schindler, while he had his factory, he had friends in very high places because he had such an amazing, outgoing personality. He was very good looking, and he was very entertaining. He had constant parties for his so-called friends, those who work for the homeland and for this war department. And he was bribing them with whiskey and expensive presents, and they loved him. He was always, you know, having parties and buying things that he was buying them actually on the black market. So he always would give them gifts for their wives or girlfriends. And he was able to accomplish a lot because they felt that he was such a good Nazi. And he worked so hard for his homeland and for the war effort. And he wanted to employ more and more workers because he needed to help the War Department to win. And so more and more people were working for Oskar Schindler, and he became a very good friend of avant-garde because he needed him. He didn't want his workers to be exposed to standing on the upper class, to standing for a roll call for hours. And so he made a deal with avant-garde. He was there like almost every other day, drinking, but he never got drunk. He gambled with them. He'd always lost. They loved him. He was a good friend. And luckily for us, when he asked that he wants to build a camp next to the factory, because he didn't want his workers to waste all this time being transported, walking back and forth. And avant-garde agreed. And I was so lucky, my mother and I, that on that first list from Plaszow to Amalia, where Oskar Schindler had his factory, the man in charge was a friend of my father, And I remember my mother sent me to him, and I told him that my mother and I wanted to go to Oskar Schindler factory, and so we did. And I cannot tell you what it meant, leaving Russia behind. It was like going from hell, from an inferno, going to heaven. Like leaving, I mean, there was no hope. There was no hope in Russia. And in Oskar Schindler factory, we had small barracks. We actually had bunkers. The guards were not allowed, not in camp and not in the factory. Oskar Schindler tried to feed us better. We actually, once a month, I remember we got an egg and probably a teaspoon of sugar. And I remember this was the biggest thing you could ever imagine. We were beating it up and beating it up, and that was heaven. And actually, there was meat in the soup, and there were potatoes. And actually, the bread in Oskar Schindler's factory really tasted like bread, not like sawdust. And Oskar Schindler came into the factory every day, and he smiled at people, and he cared about the people. I was one of the youngest, and I remember that I was working on a machine called lathe. I remember it to this day. There was on one side were all the small machines that were making shells for ammunition. And I loved doing it, and there were all young people working, and I was very fast. And one of the foremen decided to take me away from that machine and put me on another one, which was a big press. It's in a movie. And I worked on that machine for about 3 hours, and the machine broke. And the foreman came running and telling me that I committed a sabotage because I broke the machine, and he told me, and you know what you're going to get for committing a sabotage, you're going to get killed. I'm going to call the guards. Well, somebody called Oskar Schindler. I remember to this day, he walked from on the other side, there was a factory that was making the pots and pans in Malia. And he walked around the bridge, across the bridge, and he came down and he looked around and he started yelling at the foreman, telling him this machine is not built for a little girl, and you got to own it, men are allowed. And then he said to me, where do you want to work? And I said, I want to go back to my machine. And he said, that's where you're going to stay. And after that, when he came into the factory, he would pat my head, he would say, wie geht es, Kleine? And to us, Oskar Schindler was, he was like my father. He was like he was sent by God. I always felt that he would sprout wings any time. And some of the older girls were in love with him. The way he would come into the factory, the way he was dressed, and the way he was talking, and always had a different girlfriend. And he was our savior. He was everything. He was what stood between us and death. But unfortunately, this good time didn't last very long because Germany was losing the war against the Allies. But they were determined to win the war against the Jews. And so all the camps in Poland, Czechoslovakia were liquidated. And that's when Oskar Schindler made his famous deal with Amon-Get. He was going to move his factory to Czechoslovakia, and he wanted all his workers with him. So I remember before we left the factory, we were tattooed with KL, which stood for concentration camp, and the Jewish doctors did the tattooing. They'd never done it before, so they certainly didn't do a good job because like 2 years after the war, after we were, putting sand and peroxide on my arm, none of us, those who survived Schindler's List, have no tattoo. Not like the rest of my family and the people I know and love, who got a number on their arm, go to their grave with the number on their arm. And then we were sent back to Plaszow, and from Plaszow we were loaded onto trains. 300 women. And the men were, of course, sent separately. And I remember when we were loaded onto the trains, it was like 150 women in one of those boxcars. And there was no water, there were no bathroom facilities, there was no air, there was no food. It was late October, beginning of November. It was very cold already. And I remember we stood on the station in a camp for many hours before the train finally moved. And as we women fainting, we couldn't move. If one person wanted to move, everybody had to move with them. And it seemed like we were in a train for hours and hours and hours. And when the train finally stopped and the doors opened, it was very late at night. And I remember that there was a large searchlight right on our train. The doors opened, and I saw first miles and miles of barbed wire, and then I saw the sign Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then we knew that all the rumors we heard about Auschwitz-Birkenau was true. There were rumors. People were talking about places where the Jewish people are being sent and killed and gassed and burned, but we didn't believe it. And how could you believe something like that in the 20th century? That people would do such horrific, unimaginable crimes against humanity, but people who were not guilty of anything. But there we were. You know, Auschwitz, as you know, is a huge place. There is Auschwitz I, when the Germans kept their prisoners of war, political prisoners, religious prisoners, and others. But it was Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they had built the gas chambers and the crematorium. And it was to Auschwitz-Birkenau where all the Jews were brought. Now, not all victims were Jewish, but all Jews were victims. And I remember being helped down from the train by people, inmates in those uniforms, prisoners' uniform. And I remember as all those soldiers seemed to me like 1,000 of soldiers with the dogs and yelling and screaming, heraus, heraus, mach schnell. And I realized there was a terrible stench. There was such a stench. And we thought it was snowing. We were so thirsty. And so we tried to catch the snowflakes, and we realized those were the ashes. And I remember as we were running towards someplace that they were hitting us, beating us like a herd of animals. No, worse, because the Germans were very kind to their animals. And I remember seeing in the foreground big chimneys with the smoke, fire coming out of them, even though it was midnight. And then we were running, and we were stopped in front of a huge barrack where there was a group of very well-fed, very well-dressed Nazi officers. One of them especially, I remember he stood there with a whip and with a flip of his wrist. He sent some people to the left, some women to the right, left, right. We realized us going to the left could barely walk. So the rest of us just stood, we stood up, we pinched our cheeks so we would look healthy. We were sent to the right, and they told us to strip from head to bottom, and that we should fold our things nicely on the benches around the wall. We would come back for it. And under my tongue, I had a picture of my father I wanted to smuggle, but they looked into everybody's mouths, because if anybody had a gold tooth, they would pull it. I didn't have any gold teeth, but I knew they would find the picture, so I left it in my shoe, thinking I'll come back for it. And then we were shaved. We were shaved from head to bottom. And the inmates that were doing this, they were cutting our hair. They didn't have good instruments, so they were pulling our hair and cutting some skin, and we were crying, and it was hurting. And then they sprayed us. Actually, it was not a spray, but it was like a powder, and they were putting powder on. It was some kind of a disinfectant, and it was burning so much. And we were crying, and they said, well, don't cry, you're going to the showers, you're not going to the crematoriums. And then they showed us, if you look across the street, you could see the other people are going to their death. And that was in November 1944, when they were bringing all the Hungarian people who had no idea, who had never heard of Auschwitz, who never knew anything. But they sent us to a dark room, and again, those of you who saw the movie will remember it just the way it was. And it was dark in that room, no light. And when the light finally came on and the water came down, I look around, I look at my mother, and I didn't recognize anybody. Because when they shaved our hair, we felt so totally dehumanized and so traumatized that I didn't feel like me anymore. And I said to my mom, we are dead. They had killed us, but thank God, I said to my mother, now we didn't suffer, so now we don't have to worry anymore. Because, you know, when I was little, when I was young, when the war started, I had long, long braids. And when we went to ghetto, my mother cut my haircut, and my father cried. And then, as we were in the ghetto and then in concentration camp, made sure that our hair was short. But I was still a girl. We were still girls. Even though I washed my hair with cold water, there was no soap or shampoo or towel, we still would take our fingers and fix it. You know, we were still human. We were still girls. But then, I felt like there wasn't me anymore. And I remember after the shower, they pushed us to another room, and they were the women guards, the women SS guards. They were much worse, if possible, than men. And there was a bunch of clothing, a whole mountain of, on one side, there were a bunch of Dutch wooden shoes. And when you put when you're naked and you're wet, and you put your foot into a wooden shoe, you get blisters right away. And then on another side, there was a bunch of clothing. And I remember there was a yellow dress with red flowers I could see. And this was, I had my favorite dress just before the war started. And I was going to go into 5th grade. My mother finally allowed me to choose my own dress. And I remember that we went to the store and bought a fabric that was yellow with red peonies. And your mom, Rachel, made a dress for me. And Rachel's mom, my first cousin, was an amazing dressmaker. She was really an artist. She could go to a movie, see a dress, come home, made a drawing, and made a dress. And so she made dresses for the whole family. And I saw that dress line that could be mine. After all, it was yellow with a red flower. So I started pulling it up. And as I was pulling it up, I realized it was a chiffon dress, a huge dress. It must have belonged to a very big, fat lady. And so I'm pulling it up, and finally I put it on. I'm all wet, and I have to tie it around me like 10 times so I wouldn't fall out of it. It's November. It's cold. Winter comes early to Poland, and none of us, you know, had the right clothes, and they pushed us out to the other side of the barrack, and I looked around and I said to my mom, now I know we are dead. Because you cannot describe what Auschwitz was like. You can't. There is no words in any language that could really describe the horror that Auschwitz was. The long, long barracks with people, the women that looked at us that didn't look human. The food that they were giving us that was not good for a cow. The beating that we would get just standing, waiting to be counted. Women on Schindler's List were in Auschwitz-Birkenau for 3.5 weeks. It's a long time to be in Auschwitz, where they wait in Auschwitz-Birkenau, you're about waiting in line for the next opening at the crematorium, at the gas chamber. And after 3.5 weeks, a miracle happened. Oskar Schindler had bribed the commander of Auschwitz to let his women go. He did not come. Again, for those of you who saw the movie, it showed him that he came to Auschwitz. He did not. He sent his beautiful blonde secretary with a fortune of diamonds for the 300 women on Schindler's List to leave Auschwitz, put on a train to live. It was the only transport ever to leave Auschwitz to live. And I remember that this time we were able to sit in this boxcar, and one of my girlfriends was laying on my lap, and she had such a high fever, And I remember that I stuck my skinny fingers through the opening in the train little hole and tried to scrape some snowflakes or icicles to put on her lips. About an hour after we left Auschwitz-Birkenau, she broke out in scarlet fever. If she had broken out in scarlet fever and we were there, we would all have been sent to the gas chambers immediately. After all, scarlet fever was an infectious disease. And I remember that after what it seemed a long time, then the train finally stopped and the door opened. There was Oskar Schindler on this podium, standing there on the station waiting for us in his green Tyrolean hat with the feather in his head, with the cigarette always in his hands. And he said, well, you are finally here. And the men were already there, the men that came from the factory who went through Grossrosen, but they were only held in Grossrosen for 3 days. And there we were. And Mrs. Schindler came to Brünitz to help Oskar to take care of us. They had a villa in the Brünitz outside the factory, a beautiful villa. They never slept there. They had a tiny apartment on the factory floor because they were afraid to leave us, that if they wouldn't be there, the guards would kill us. And the captain, actually he was more of a captain, Obersturmführer Leopold, was only telling Oskar Schindler how much work he can get out of those Jews and how he can get rid of them when they can't, which of course was not what Oskar Schindler wanted. So Oskar Schindler was always, again, bribing the guards, and so that they wouldn't, do anything that he didn't want them to do. Mrs. Schindler was going through one farm to another to try buy food for us, because those days it was very difficult to buy food already. And the last 7 months of the war, in 1945, one of the worst winters in the history, I think, of the 20th century, where hundreds of thousands of my Jewish brothers and sisters were put on a death march, where they perished from the frost, from the snow, from the hunger, from the sicknesses, from being killed and shot, but not being able to keep up. Those of us on Schindler's List, we were warm, we were hungry, but we were not starving. And so when the war finally was ending, Oskar Schindler called us to the factory floor and told us that he was going to have to leave because we were going to be liberated by the Russians. He, being the owner of the factory, a capitalist, a producer of ammunition, and an owner of slaves, who would be killed. And I remember that we all wrote letters, affidavits, so that he could give himself up to the Americans. He had to leave and go with the Americans to Austria. Some of our young men came to accompany Oskar Schindler. They were dressed and armed by the Czech underground. And the rest of the young men in the factory were also dressed and armed by the Czech underground, but they were afraid that the retreating German army might still come and kill us. And we waited for about almost probably 4 or 5 days, because the Russian soldier came into the camp on a horse, little horse. I always saw he came on a donkey. And he stood there and he said, "You are now liberated by the victorious Russian army." And we said to him, "Where did you come from?" He said, "I came from Krakow." And so we asked him, "Is anybody left?" He said, "No, and you don't want to go there because they don't want you there." But of course, that's where we all wanted to go. Most of us were from Krakow and vicinity. So finally, the Russian arranged to make a transport for us to go back. It was very difficult because a lot of the railroads were bombed. And when we finally came to Krakow, and first night, because it was dark, it was late, they told us it was too dangerous for Jewish people to walk. And we spent the night in a school, I remember, which happened to be just right across the street from where my uncle Leon lived with his wife, Romek and Hanka, the children and mom. And then the next day, early when it got light, we went to my street, my house, and my mother and I, this was like two apartment buildings together, 4-story high. My mother and I were the only one that came back, only one that survived. Around the corner from our house, there was 4 apartment buildings, 4-story high. Nobody came back. My father's 6 brothers were killed. 2 of the younger brothers survived. They were not married, so when the war started, they ran away to Russia, and that's how they survived. My mother's whole family, her parents, her brothers, her sisters, my little cousins, they were all gone. Nobody was left. My father's sister survived, my 4 cousins survived, my 5 girl cousins survived, and 3 boy cousins survived. We were lucky that we had anybody who survived. Most of my friends who survived were orphans. On Schindler's List, people survived, they were families. They were with their mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers, some of them. On Oskar Schindler's camp, 2 people died, both normal deaths. One was a young girl who died from bone cancer, and another was an older woman who died of a heart attack. Both of them were buried in a casket and buried in a plot in a cemetery where the families knew where they were. And you think that all those millions and hundreds of thousands of people have no grave that we know of. None of my uncles, my aunts, my little cousins did not survive. And that's why it's so important for us to keep the memory alive. Because to get your mind around 6 million, that's too much. You cannot understand. But if you think of my little cousin Jenny, who was only 5 years old, or her sister Rita, who was my age, or my cousin Manek, who was killed in Plaszów, and all the other people who, if given a chance, if they had survived, some of them would have maybe become scientists who found cure for cancer, or musicians, or famous writers, poets, or any decent human beings they would have been if Hitler didn't kill them. And that's why it's so important for people, and especially younger children, to realize that you cannot stand by and do nothing when you see injustice done. That to be a bystander is worse than to be a perpetrator. And we have to teach our children to be what we call upstander. When you see something wrong, when you see somebody bullying a child, your friend in school, don't just stand by, do nothing. Get help. Go talk to your teacher, talk to your parents, talk to the police. Don't stand by and do nothing, because the future belongs to the younger generation, and we certainly are not leaving them a world that's peaceful. And I think that to sit by and let somebody bully a child or an adult, especially children in school, there is so much of it going on. And we have to teach our children to stand up, to make them realize that they have the power to make a difference. They can use their brains to think, what is a coward? What is a bully? Bully is a coward. A coward will only attack somebody who is weaker than they are. Well, if 2 people go against one coward, they can make a huge difference. And I think we have to hope that the world will change and that we will not be exposed to any more of genocide. I never thought that I would live to see so much genocide going on. I remember when the war in Korea broke out, I could not believe that there could be another war so soon after the first war that was supposed to end all the war. And then, of course, when you think of what's going on now, we have Somalia, Rwanda, Darfur, You have Kosovo. Who suffers the most? Women and children. And people just sit and talk, and nobody's doing anything. So I know I'm too old, and I won't see any change. But I hope with all my heart that our grandchildren, great-grandchildren will be able to change the world for better. And I thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'd be happy to answer it. But,
thank you, Rita. Yes.
You said that in Krakow, the local population of the Poles did not want Jews back. So when you did go back, what happened?
That's a very good question, because what happened is not so good. Because what happened is that, for example, when the survivors started to come back to Krakow to look for their loved ones, we were given a home that used to be a dormitory at one time for one of the colleges. And that's where people lived. Again, there were little apartments, a lot of people were there. My uncle, my grandfather lived there. And one day, it was surrounded by Polish youth, and there was stones, and they were ready to attack the whole building. And there were probably about 400 people living there. And the Polish police stood by and did nothing. But the Russians came. At that time, at the very beginning, after the war, the Russians were very helpful. And the Russians came, and the Russians stood by and guarded that building till probably for about another 2 years, till everybody finally left Poland. And some of the young people who were not from Krakow, by surrounding communities, when they went back to find their loved ones, to see if anybody survived, if anybody came back, the Polish people in the small towns were afraid that the people who were returning would want some of their stuff back. You know, people left apartments with everything in it, and the Polish people took it. And after they killed them, they were killed. Many. I personally have a friend who was killed because he went back to Kielce. It was a very known pogrom in Kielce when the farmers told them there's no more train and you can stay in my barn till the morning. And at night the people came and killed them. So it was very dangerous. It was very dangerous. And it still is not a place that I would like to live. I love my city. I still love the house where I used to live with my parents. But the people, I don't trust them. I don't trust them. I mean, there's a new museum now in Warsaw, just opening this next month. And it's built on the place where the ghetto was. And it was, funded by the Polish government and some of the Jewish organizations. So it's a big, it's going to be a lot of big ceremonies. But, and some people say that it will change, but I believe that the Polish people, those who have never known any Jewish people, never, and some of them, they are still anti-Semitic.
Question.
You mentioned that person sitting next to you in the train had scarlet fever. When you got to the place and Oscar Schindler was there, what did he do about that person with the scarlet fever? Did you ever come down?
I was sort of in and out when you were asking it.
I didn't quite get your question.
Oh, okay. You were in this train heading to what was it, Czechoslovakia?
Yeah.
I mean, after the camp.
Yeah. And the person sitting next to you with her head on your lap had scarlet fever.
Right. My friend Herta, she survived.
So you didn't come down with it?
You didn't get sick?
No, no. I had scarlet fever actually when I was, I think, 5 years old.
And now, what did Oscar Schindler do about the person
They
who
put
was
her
sick?
into, they had Mrs. Schindler, had a little, like a clinic at the basement of the factory, and she took care of the people that were sick. So, yeah.
Yes.
Having a number of years ago gone to Krakow and gone to Auschwitz and to Birkenau, and seeing what happened to Krakow and what it looked like then, this was like in the late 90s. Have you ever gone back?
You visited to know if you got back to Krakow.
Yeah, I did. I went back to Krakow probably about 17 years ago, and the first time probably about 20 years ago or so, but then it was a very emotional experience. I remember coming there and we stood in I went with a group, with another group, because I did not want to go by myself. I mean, just my husband and I was afraid. I was afraid of how we would feel, how we would react. So I remember that we came late in the afternoon and we took a cab from the hotel where we stayed a little outside of Krakow, and the cab dropped us off in the middle, in the center of Krakow. And I got up, and my husband, who was older than me, he didn't know what he was like. And I said, just give me a minute. And I just realized where I was, and I walked right straight down the street. I remember there was a restaurant where my mother used to take me. I walked down to where I went to school, and around the corner where I lived, and around another corner where my grandparents lived. There were some people standing in front of my house. I still call it my house, so I want you to know it was an apartment house. And it was the first one built as a co-op. I didn't know that before. I found it then when I went to Krakow, but it's still my house. and the women were talking, and showing my husband where I lived, and told them right away that I used to live there, and so they wouldn't say, we're calling police, what was the people doing? And so they allowed us, they called the person who was in charge, who was the superintendent of the building, and we found a ledger, and I have it in the house. They made copies for it. And my father bought that apartment, and that he paid 50 zloty a month for the rent, and that he bought it in 1929, where I was born. And there were other people in it, and they have it all written out. And then I asked if I could see my apartment, and there was actually the person who lived there was somebody who moved in after we were sent to the ghetto. But he certainly was not to blame. He had no knowledge of it. But he allowed us to come up to see. He was 90 years old at the time, and he was a lawyer. And he was a widower, and his daughter lived nearby, and she used to come, and she complained about him. He didn't want any help. I walked into this apartment, the same floor in the foyer. I remember when my parents had built a wall unit for hanging clothes, for putting the skis in, it was there. The same fixture that I remember when my mother bought when they were painting the apartment for the same fixture. The stove, the ovens, coal ovens in the bathrooms, in the bedrooms, in the kitchen, everything was the same. Mm-hmm. The only thing that wasn't the same is that the poor man collected. He was a lawyer. So I think for 70 years he collected paper. He had no room in his bedroom, that was mine. He slept in the kitchen, and the kitchen was a small little room for where the maid used to sleep. That's where he slept. But there were little changes, there was no more coals, we had gas, and the floor, I think, was changed a little bit with age. And what he said to me, if there's anything you want, you can have it. Because, all the Polish people saw, the Jewish people came back, it's because they left some diamonds or money, and that's what we would like. It was not so. We didn't leave anything there but memories. So, okay.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Do you think that Oscar Schindler was influenced by his wife? You said that she participated also. I didn't realize before that she was a participant in saving also. Do you think it has something to do that they were a couple?
Well, you know, I always feel that if it wasn't for Emily Schindler, Oscar Schindler couldn't do all those things, because if she was a good Nazi wife, she would have reported him. But she was a wonderful person. She certainly deserved better than Oscar, but she was a wonderful person. She was very good to the people. And I remember at one time she got some farina from some of the farmers, because they were both, Oscar and Emily came from that section of Czechoslovakia, so they knew a lot of people and they knew the farmer. At one time she bought farina, and she cooked farina in the little kitchen on the factory floor. And so the young children, myself included, would go walk, I remember, with a little cup to the kitchen. We'd get half a cup of farina and go back, and nobody would share it with her, like I want to share with my mother. She, you know, it was just for the children. And also my mother got very sick. She got an infection of her gums. And I remember going to Emily Schindler and telling her, I remember she gave me an onion for my mother. And that cured her, because, you know, onion is vitamin C. And she would take such wonderful care of people. She was very, very wonderful. And like I said, she deserved better than Oscar.
Thank you.
Wacky?
I'm just curious to know what your story was about coming to America.
The story of coming to America?
How she came to America.
Oh, how did I get to the United States? I was very lucky, because United States, the State Department was also very anti-Semitic, and they were very anxious not to let many Jewish people in. But we were very lucky. I had a very good friend whose brother-in-law had an uncle in Peabody, and he sent us paper. My uncle, Harry White, didn't know us. He was not a rich man. He was working as a bookkeeper for some leather factory in Peabody, and he sent paper for my husband and me, and so we came to the United States because it was the first place that wanted us.
We have one more question here in front.
I'm a student and performing artist, and I'm just moved to be able to tell the story that you've told here tonight further, and I wanted to know from you what you thought in terms of what was most important for me representing the generation that you're talking about being younger. Is this something that in itself can be told as a story and will make a difference, or in our schools do you think that we need to be doing a better job of teaching about being a bystander and about being active and about taking a role in a stand? Is it just a story, or do you think we need to be doing more that we're really not yet?
Well, I think that it is, in my story, I hope it will help to teach the people, the children, that you have to be responsible for your action, that you have to think about the other person. And I remember that John Kennedy once said that when you cut your finger, whether you are black or white or yellow or whatever, everybody's blood is red. And I think also that another quote that I like to use, so I may not be exactly right, I can't think right now of the name of the person that I'm quoting, but the age makes you forget. But I think it was Albert Einstein who said the world is a terrible place, not because of the people that do bad, but of the people that do nothing. And I think that it's important to tell our children and grandchildren that they can do something, that they have the power to make a difference, that they can make choices, and that they basically know in their heart what is a good choice. It's not a good choice to throw a stone at somebody. It's a good choice to make sure that nobody throws stones. I see a lot, I talk to a lot of young people, usually middle school, high school, universities, And that's one of my messages that I try to tell all those people, that you have to be responsible for your action, and you have to be responsible for realizing if there is injustice being done, someone's going to be beaten up, whether it's by words or by sticks, that you can help, that you can't tell them, well, you cannot be. We have a big sign everywhere, be an upstander. Don't stand by and do nothing. You have the power to make a difference. And I like to tell the kids in school that they can, write a letter or email or telegram, whatever they want to their president, vice president, the Senate or the congressman, anyone. They can write a letter and they will get a letter back. Or if they email the White House, they get a letter back. They think it's from the president. They don't realize there is a huge group of people employed in the mail offices that will reply. But I think that it's very important to make the children realize that they don't have to sit there and take it. They can make a difference. And I hope otherwise, I don't know what's going to happen. I certainly would like to see my grandchildren or my great-granddaughter not to have to worry about war and hate and anti-Semitism and bigotry and hate. I think that hate is people that are so consumed by hate that it eats them up and they start the fire. And we have to hope that we can, make sure the fire goes off, that it doesn't go on. And like I said, I won't see that, but I certainly hope you will. Thank you.